Fred Watkins, tried and convicted of murder in 1901, was Alaska's first legal execution for murder on September 19, 1902 in Nome. Information on the trial is sparse and fragmented. The newspaper accounts, including those written by Mary E. Hart, which were picked up from the Associated Press wire or reprinted from other papers, provide details of Hardy's trial, along with Judge James Wickersham's diary and sworn testimony taken by various court officials. While there was a court reporter at the trial, according to Judge Wickersham's diary, trial transcripts have not been located. The trial and execution highlight the slow reactionary process by government officials as the territory dealt with an influx of stampeders in search of quick wealth from the 1870s through the 1900s. In June 1900, Congress enacted the Civil Code of Alaska, dividing the territory into 3 judicial divisions. The first division went to Judge M.C. Brown, already in Juneau at the time, and covered the Alaska Panhandle from Skagway and Dyea southward to Ketchikan, including Sitka. This district was especially important because of the criminal elements in and around Dyea and Skagway during the height of the Yukon Gold Rush from 1898 to 1900. The second division was headquartered in Nome and had the added incentive of making a small fortune in gold. Judge Arthur Nose of Minneapolis was selected for this division to resolve over 25,000 mining disputes brought on by the 1900 Nome Gold Rush. However, due to a scandal involving his staff placing the disputed claims into receivership, a form of quasi-legalized claim jumping, so they could be mined, Nose left Nome in disgrace in the fall of 1900 under a cloud of suspicion for malfeasance in office. The third division encompassed the Alaska Interior, the Aleutians, and the South Central Alaska area, and headquartered at Eagle, a town of 300 near the Canadian border, to regulate trade on the Yukon River. There were no roads to the interior. Into this new role stepped James Wickersham, seeking to escape political enemies in Washington state. He would be temporarily placed in charge of the situation in Nome left by the departure of Nose. He would return to Eagle by the fall of 1901 when Judge Alfred Moore would finally arrive in Nome to replace him. The Yukon and Nome gold rushes would change the legal landscape in the Alaska Territory. While the Organic Act of 1884 established federal courts in Alaska, they were largely ineffective due to the lack of judges and lawyers. In their absence, many Alaskans and stampeders recognized the rules and rulings of miners' meetings. The trappings of a court procedure, except representation for the accused parties, included due process, reasoned decisions, and legal forms including the application of the death penalty. The only judge in the 1890s, previously mentioned Judge M.C. Brown, was swamped with work as 30,000 stampeders poured into the territory to try to strike it rich in the Yukon. Some judges came and went and supplied little in the way of law or justice. James Wickersham would prove to be more ambitious and adventurous. He was required to travel hundreds of miles in steamboat, dog sled, and foot. Wickersham and Brown proposed to use the United States revenue cutters to carry them to various locations to settle disputes. Quote, on March 28, 1901, the Department of Justice approved Wickersham's request, and he embarked on the first floating court voyage to Unalaska and Valdez. End quote. Wickersham's first trial in the 2nd District took him to Unalaska. Due to the lack of court officials and even juries, they were required to travel with the judges. 34 jurors for the grand jury and the jury trial were brought from Nome since the local Aleuts were not eligible to serve on juries at the time, and the population of Unalaska was sparse. The facts of the case were reported in several newspapers despite a lack of wide coverage. Montana newspapers were the exception since the Sullivans were from Butte. Here's an excerpt from the Anaconda Standard. In addition to the testimony of Owen Jackson, the survivor of the Sullivan Party, which has already been published, strong evidence was collected against the young man. In company with a man named Williams, he deserted from the schooner Arago in Unimak. He, Hardy, then, it is believed, crossed the island to the east side of Cape Lupan and there shot the three men, Florence and Cornelius Sullivan and P.J. Rooney. He stood on a high bank above them, it is alleged, and opened fire. This was on June 7th. He secured a dory and rowed around by False Pass to the northeast corner of the island, where he gambled with fishermen. There he stopped in a cabin belonging to two men, both of whom were held as witnesses against him. It was at this place that he was arrested. When Hardy heard that officers were after him, he tied up, it is claimed, a gold watch, a diamond pin, and a few other pieces of jewelry in a kerchief and hid them. They were found by the deputy marshal. The watch bore the inscription Julius to Florence, the latter being the first name of one of the Sullivans. On September 3, 1901, the trial of Fred Hardy began, and by the 5th, the prosecution would rest after calling 3 witnesses. Wickersham does not record the names of these witnesses. The defense called any witnesses according to Wickersham's diary. The pretrial statements were given by several people, including Fred Hardy, Charles Schomer, and George Aston, who was captured with Hardy and originally implicated in the murder and imprisoned by the crew aboard the revenue cutter Manning. Aston was with the Sullivans and Rooney where the murder took place and stated first, quote, that his party of 4 had been attacked by natives. Later he said that it was 2 white men that shot Sutherland brothers and Rooney. His conflicting statements have led the marshals to suspect him of the crime, end quote. How and why Aston was cleared of suspicion is not known. Hardy stated that he enlisted in the, quote, United States Cavalry at Columbus, Ohio, and thence to the Philippines, reaching there on September 15, 1898. He remained there until January 10, 1901, where he stated that he held the position of second lieutenant and was mustered out at the Presidio, San Francisco. He claimed that he received as pay when mustered out $1,875.75, end quote. Several statements given would refute Hardy's testimony. One statement by Charles Schomer, quote, employed as a bugler on the United States revenue cutter Manning, end quote, states that, quote, he became acquainted with Fred Hardy, and to my knowledge, he was a private soldier of the 1st Tennessee Volunteer Infantry, end quote, refuting accounts of Hardy being reported as an officer. Hardy claimed that the $1,875 in cash in his possession at the time of his arrest was back pay from his 2 years of military service. But Hardy was convicted of larceny in April of 1900 and sentenced to 2 years, but reduced to 1, which was spent at Alcatraz Island. Hardy forfeited all pay for his conviction. Hardy's signed witness statement in September of 1901 tells yet another story. Hardy came to Alaska aboard the schooner Arago and was sent to find fresh water on Unimak Island when he left the ship. Hardy requested that the captain and mate testify on his behalf on the date when he left the ship, and that he was aboard the ship on January 7th, the date of the murders. After 4 12-hour days of trial testimony and evidence and deliberation, Hardy was convicted of murder on September 7th, 1901, and sentenced to hang by Judge Wickersham. Hardy was held at the jail in Nome while his attorneys filed for appeal. 2 routes were taken to a new trial: a letter to President Roosevelt, whom Hardy stated that he had once saved his life, and the Supreme Court. The execution was stayed pending the results of the appeals. On the first appeal, President Roosevelt declined any interference in the case. According to the June 21, 1902 edition of the Nome Nugget, quote, on Wednesday evening, Assistant District Attorney McGinn received the mandate of the Supreme Court, which affirmed the sentence of the lower court, end quote. The decision reached Nome, and on July 18, 1902, Judge Alfred Moore reinstated the original verdict handed down by Judge Wickersham. Why Mary E. Hart decided to go to Nome is unknown, but she was a correspondent for the Los Angeles Herald, among newspapers, and may have been sent by the newspaper. In a letter to a relative, her mother commented, "She's a newspaper correspondent, so it does not cost her much to travel." In a 1901 article, Hart, quote, has acquired several good claims in the Klondike, a general term used for both Alaska and the Yukon Territory, which she confidently expects will realize a fortune for her, end quote. However, Mary's focus was as a newspaper woman. Quote, her services as a journalist for California papers bring her about $60 per month, and she has free transportation, end quote. It is unclear how Mary E. Hart gained access to the jail to visit Hardy. One theory is that she was sent there in order to coerce a confession to the murders. Newspapers picked up a story and reported that she gained access to Hardy as a nurse in a Red Cross capacity after Hardy's death, but there are no records of Hart as a member of the Red Cross. During this time in Nome, there were actually two women named Mary E. Hart. One of them was a seamstress. This was not the Mary that is being discussed. Mary's local reputation as a journalist and her friendship with Judge Alfred Moore through the Alaska Academy of Sciences, founded in Nome, may have been enough to secure an interview with Hardy. The newspaper accounts of Hardy's trial and execution are nearly identical in their coverage. More original coverage came from the Nome newspapers. Mary did contribute to a Nome Nugget story. Quote, Mrs. Hart will attend the execution on the 19th and report the hanging for her paper, end quote. The Los Angeles Express reported in a letter that, quote, the Express is in receipt of a bit of rope from which the hanging was accomplished. The gruesome relic was presented by the hangman to the Los Angeles woman, end quote. A 1905 story published by the St. Louis Globe-Democrat included two personal photographs of the scaffold and Hardy displayed in his coffin after the hanging, taken by Hart. In only two articles does Mary mention that she tried to secure a confession from Hardy, giving weight to the previous assertion. Hardy denied his involvement in the murders. In this article, Mary describes a trip on the steamer Oregon, sailing to Seattle after the execution. She was approached by a woman named Mrs. Barker, who claimed to be a clairvoyant and described Hardy's physical form to Hart in a brief encounter. Quote, every time I have met you, I have seen the figure of a young man, end quote. Mary asked the woman to watch the figure for the remainder of the journey. Mrs. Barker reported that the figure grew less distinct and, quote, when we left the Bering Sea, it vanished entirely, end quote. In 1915, a second account of Hart's encounter with Hardy's ghost was published, including a second story. To secure Hart's reputation, the account begins with, quote, Mrs. Hart is not a credulous person. She is a big, capable, masterful sourdough who has homesteaded, mined, and broken trail and mushed in the wildest parts of Alaska for 15 years, end quote. As Mary related in the story, quote, I have always been afraid to tell why I can never come back to Nome. It grew out of my unwilling part in the first legal execution in the territory. I was then reporting for a Nome paper and had been assigned to cover the execution and try for a confession from Hardy, end quote. She recounted a brief discussion with Hardy about life after death and the manifestation of the dead to the living. Hart responded to Hardy and said he would be welcome to visit. Quote, what else could I have said to a boy about to die, end quote. The balance of the article recounts Mary's description of Hardy's ghost haunting her. Quote, for many hideous nights I sat rigid in my chair, unable to move or speak. It was as though I were being choked to death, as if I were undergoing what that 21-year-old youth must have experienced. I am confident I would have died but for an interruption, end quote. A girl known as Sunshine had entered the office and saw Hardy's ghost and immediately, quote, fell to the floor, alternately fainting and hysterical, end quote. According to the account, Sunshine, who had not witnessed the execution, began to speak in Hardy's voice. Quote, that almost lethal paralysis left my body at that instant. Sunshine touched my shoulder. Until I left Nome, I was haunted day and night. The obsession did not cease until I was aboard the boat bound for San Francisco, where at least one other person saw this ghostly presence, end quote. The previously mentioned Mrs. Barker. Hart never did return to Nome after either 1903 or 1904. Nome was yet another turning point for Mary E. Hart's life. Her experiences and activities in Nome would set in motion events that would dominate her work for the rest of her life. While Hart went to Nome to cover the Nome Gold Rush for California newspapers, she helped to found two organizations, the Aurora Women's Club and the Alaska Academy of Sciences, and was instrumental in their development. She would be charged with custody of the exhibit of the Academy of Sciences for the Alaska building at the 1904 Louisiana Purchase Exposition. Judge Moore and Governor John G. Brady were members of this short-lived but important organization. While in Nome, Mary also met Judge James Wickersham and Dr. Sheldon Jackson, although it is not clear how she was introduced to these two men, and these relationships were pivotal as they would ultimately lead her to be selected as the lady manager of the Domestic Arts and Education exhibits for the Alaska building at the Louisiana Purchase Exposition in 1904, and again at the Alaska Yukon Pacific Exposition in 1909. Thank you.